What about the risks to them? Well, the risks to them are destruction. Since the U.S. and British, two of them, their reaction to the September 11th was to conduct a policy which is driving hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Afghans to starvation and destruction. That's not a big secret. So let's say Mary Robinson, when she issued a plea to, she's only one of many, incidentally, but it's important because of who she is, issued a plea to the United States to stop the bombing so that food could get to people, huge numbers of people who are just, on the verge of starvation. And there's only a couple of weeks before winter. And she warned of a Rwanda-style slaughter if this didn't happen. How do you deal with that in the American press? Easy. It received precisely 3 sentences in the American press. 1 sentence in the New York Times, which didn't give the content, buried in a story on another topic. 2 scattered sentences in the San Francisco Chronicle, which you couldn't understand unless you understood the background. The UN Special Rapporteur for Food, on World Food Day, which is ignored here, issued an even stronger plea. And also condemned the airdrops as, like every aid agency has done, as extremely harmful, just a vulgar propaganda tool, and in fact harmful. How do you deal with that? 0 sentences in the U.S. press. And we can continue. When the aid agencies like Oxfam and Save the Children and Christian Aid and so on pleaded for an end to the bombing, virtually nothing. And that's, so when you ask how do people react, well, it depends who the people are. The general public can't, you really can't know this unless you do a research project. An ordinary person would hardly have a way of knowing this. Intellectual elites know it, and they suppress it. So if you read the elite press, especially the left liberal press, which is usually the worst historically, I must say, historically that's true, and it is again. If you read them, every writer, this is true in England too, almost every writer says it's not only a just war, but it's, I'll quote from the American Prospect, the most respectable left liberal journal, its current issue, it's not only a just war, but only radical extremists could question whether it's a just war. Well, the same day that this appeared, there was a meeting in Peshawar, Pakistan, of about 1,000 Afghan leaders, reported all over the place, I'm sure in Ireland. These are many of them from Afghanistan, others from elsewhere. These are the people who the West is, or U.S. and Britain, are sort of grooming to be the post-Taliban government, the good guys. Well, they disagreed about a lot of things, but there's one thing they agreed about. The bombing is criminal and has to be stopped. You're killing the donkey, not the rider, as one said, to a lot of applause. Now, so here we have, so they're the radical extremists. They're the only ones who could question that it's just war. Well, who's going to know this?
If we can broaden it out a bit and look at the various different alliances, particularly in the Middle East, that Britain and America have built, can you see these lasting?
It's very fragile. I mean, Saudi Arabia, which is a very brutal and extreme fundamentalist country, has been a U.S. client since its origins, but it's very fragile. The population is strongly opposed to, much of it is strongly opposed to the government, and in fact, part of the anger against the United States, even among the wealthy sectors, is that they support a very oppressive and brutal government, not only there, but throughout the region. The only newspaper in the United States that's been frank and open about this is the Wall Street Journal, which has been, in fact. So that's many observers who are close by sense feeling like Iran in 1979, just being held together. Qatar, which is considered so loyal that that's where the World Trade Organization is meeting, has officially condemned the bombing. It hasn't been reported here, but it happened. Kuwait is so split that they won't take a position. The governments are sort of trying to support it, but they can't because of their own popular opposition. So yes, that's very fragile.
If we look at this crisis in Afghanistan, it seems to be bookended on one side by Palestine and Israel, and the other side by Pakistan and India. What do you see happening in both these cases?
In Israel and Palestine, the world knows, even if it's not known here, that there's a harsh, brutal military occupation going into its 35th year. It's been sustained by U.S. economic, military, and diplomatic support. When helicopters are used for assassinations or attacking apartment complexes, they are U.S. helicopters sent in the certain knowledge that they're going to be used for these purposes. I can give you the details if you like. If you're living in a refugee camp, you don't have to read Jane's Weekly to find it out. You see it, you know. It's not reported here, but it's true. For 25 years, the United States has been literally alone in the world in blocking a diplomatic settlement. There's a name for that. It's called the peace process. It began...
Which you think's a bit of a sham.
Well, I mean, Orwell wouldn't have thought so. He would thought that's exactly what we should call a peace process. Starting in 1976, when the U.S. vetoed a Security Council resolution supported by the whole world, Arab states, PLO, Russia, Europe, everyone. There was a resolution calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, with UN 242, all the rights and guarantees and everything else. Everyone in favor of it. U.S. vetoed it. That means it's vetoed from history as well. That's continued. Vetoed another one a couple of years later, voted against them. Every similar resolutions in the General Assembly, virtually unanimous all the time. Blocked every European effort, Arab effort, PLO effort, every effort to negotiate. Finally, after the Gulf War, the U.S. was able to take it over itself. It was strong enough. And it's been ramming through its own unilateral rejectionism. And that goes right up to the Clinton proposals last at Camp David. Well, yeah, that's a big issue. Like when bin Laden issues his appeals about this, people know what he's talking about. Maybe the U.S. doesn't want to hear it, but they know it. And I should say you left out an important case, Iraq. Part of the anger against the United States in the region from wealthy professionals, from bankers and professionals and lawyers and businessmen, is the U.S. policy of U.S.-British policy of devastating the civilian society of Iraq while strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they know, even if Britain and the United States would like to forget it, that Britain and the United States supported Saddam right through his worst atrocities, like the gassing of the Kurds in Halabja, the worst atrocity, which now Robin Cook and others throw at him. Yeah, a horrible atrocity which Britain and the United States supported and continued to support him afterwards. When bin Laden says that, people know what he's talking about.
Bin Laden's organization is also very active in Kashmir, on the Pakistani side. America has moved towards the Pakistani side, it seems. There are two nuclear powers, India, Pakistan. Will the Americans move against India to assuage Pakistan?
Can't. I mean, the United States can't afford to lose India as a important ally. It's just too big and important. And Pakistan, they don't really care about. They need Pakistan right now. But after this is over, and, Pakistanis ought to understand this, if they want to kick Pakistan in the face, they'll do it. It's not that important. But right now, they need them. It's not just India and Pakistan they need. Take a look at the coalition, what's called the Anti-Terror Coalition. Coalition of the Just against terrorism. Who's in it? Well, every terror state in the world. Russia's enthusiastic about it because they want U.S. support for their massive atrocities in Chechnya. China thinks it's wonderful because they think they'll get U.S. support for their own atrocities in Western China against secessionists. Algeria thinks it's great. It's maybe the worst terrorist state in the world, but they're delighted to have support for their own violence against their own population. And in fact, run through the list. Uzbekistan's pretty happy. It's one of the most violent, repressive states in the world. So yeah, they'd love to have U.S. support. That's the coalition of the just. Incidentally, just for the record, not everyone is allowed into it. So the U.S. made it very clear that if the FSLN, the Sandinistas, win the election in Nicaragua, they're not going to be allowed into it because they're terrorists. They're terrorists because the U.S. was condemned by the World Court and the Security Council for attacking them. So therefore, they're not allowed in. But if Russia wants to massacre people in Chechnya, they're certainly allowed.
Let's look at this coalition of the just. Given that they are the most significant financial, diplomatic and political powers on earth. What sort of future do you see by the year 2010?
Well, we have a projection, an authoritative analysis by the U.S. intelligence community in a big study just published not long ago, combined with academics and businessmen and others. And it was called the Projection for the Next 15 Years. 2015 happened to be their projection. And they gave various scenarios. The most optimistic one was that, I'll virtually quote it, that globalization, meaning what they call globalization, a very special form of integration, globalization will continue on course, which will lead to further inequality and financial volatility. Well, financial volatility slows growth, and in fact what they call globalization has been has harmed economic growth and development pretty much worldwide as compared with the preceding 25 years, and that'll continue. Inequality will continue to grow. I should say that U.S. military planning is based on exactly the same assumption. Another thing that is kept from the public, pretty much, are the actual plans of the military. And this is not Bush, because Clinton years is even the same thing. If you look, the major plan is for militarization of space, expanding offensive military capacity into space. I mean, it's called an arms race, but the U.S. is alone. Nobody's part of it. And that's extremely dangerous, and it is based on the same reasoning, explicitly. You read the publications of the U.S. Space Command, they say the way the world's going, there's going to be a sharper divide between the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are, of course, most everybody. And that's going to lead to turmoil and disruption. And therefore, we have to have an offensive military capacity, which will be instant, destructive, and overwhelming. And space is the right place for it. And it goes under the guise of missile defense. But anyone sensible knows that when you hear the word defense, you read offense. And in fact, the goal is placing offensive military weapons in space, which they know is going to be extremely dangerous. I mean, they expect it to be a hazard to survival, but essential for, in their words, and they highlight this, for protecting U.S. commercial and investment interests around the world in the face of a rising number of have-nots, which will be the result of what they call globalization. So yes, this is all reasonable. It's a huge danger to survival. It's based on an analysis which makes sense, namely a growing gap between small sector of wealthy. And it's not rich countries, because remember, the countries themselves are split. So in the United States, there's a small sector of wealth, very small, and for most of the population it's stagnant or worse, but the gap will grow. And that means you have to control people in the rich countries. You can't do it by force, so you do it by propaganda. You control the rest of the world by militarization and instant destruction if necessary. You aim for total domination. If you read the intellectual literature, what intellectuals write, they explain that this is, they know it, and they explain that this is right. So you can read from the liberal New Republic over to the conservative national interest. You get the same picture. This is what we're doing. It's right. What's called missile defense is actually an offensive system, which will give the U.S. further power to do what it wants. And this is right, and it's right for a very good reason. And now I'm quoting, history has a direction and a purpose, and the United States manifests that purpose. Therefore, it is to the good of everyone if the United States has world domination. There is nothing novel about this. John Stuart Mill was saying the same thing 150 years ago.
Noam Chomsky